Hi everyone. 24 years ago in 1996, coincidentally the year that I graduated from college, voters in California passed Proposition 209, which prohibited the use of affirmative action by the state of California in public employment, public contracting, and public university admissions. This year, California voters are deciding whether to support Proposition 16, which would undo Proposition 209. We're pleased today to be able to partner with the Campaign for College Opportunity for a discussion about the legacy of Proposition 209 and why it's time now to throw it into the dustbin of history. Michele Siqueiros is the president of the Campaign for College Opportunity, and I want to introduce her now and thank her so much for bringing together the co-chairs of the Yes on 16 campaign for today's discussion. We're really going to have an opportunity to go in deep. Thank you so much, Michele. So also joining us, as I said, the co-chairs of the Yes on 16 campaign, Vincent Pan, who's the co-executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action, Eva Paterson, who's the president of the Equal Justice Society, and Thomas A. Saenz, president and general counsel of MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. So let's dive in. First of all, thinking back to Proposition 209, it's been almost 25 years since voters passed it. Eva, I would love to start with you. I know you've been fighting this for a long time. Can you just tell us, how has Proposition 209 impacted the opportunities available to communities of color in California for the past quarter century?
Well, thank you for having us here today. And the effects have been rather devastating. Just to give you one example, at Berkeley Law School, there were 30 Black students admitted under special admissions. After affirmative action was eliminated that next year, there was not one Black student admitted. So think of the devastation. One of the ways that communities of color excel is to get educated. Then you have higher income. Your children often are able to go to better schools. You have better health care. So there's a whole constellation of effects that flow from having us better educated. Secondly, in employment, the state employment numbers were very bad for California. And Tom will talk about a little bit later the chilling effect that Proposition 209 has had on the ability of state officials to even talk about this. But the State Personnel Board tried to have more Latinos, Asian Americans, African Americans employed by state government. A lawsuit was brought that stopped that desegregation. One of the most devastating impacts of Proposition 209 is in the area of state contracting. All communities of color pay taxes, yet because race has not been able to be taken into account in the award of contracts, businesses owned by women and people of color have lost $1 billion a year. And I often think how different our state would be had that money been in our pockets. People of color often hire other people of color. We would have more wealth, which would lead to more power, both politically and economically. So the impact of Proposition 209 has been really quite devastating.
Thanks. And just one quick follow-up question to that. So it's been 25 years. What have been some of the impediments in the past to trying to overturn it?
Well, one of the devious things that they did, and I used to call it brilliant, but I was talking with some folks in LA and they said, don't give the authors of 209 that much credit. They weren't brilliant, they were devious. The language of the initiative sounds compelling because it tracks the language of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So when we've done polling for 12 years on this, and when you look at the language of Proposition 209, it seems very reasonable. And it takes some time to explain the harm that it has occasioned on or brought to people of color and women. Also, the electorate in California for decades was predominantly white, and I have nothing against white people. That's not why I'm saying this. But as a result directly of Pete Wilson demonizing undocumented immigrants, the electorate has turned in a very different direction. And now the majority of the electorate, that's Latinos. And so now that we have a different electorate, people can look at things differently because people aren't feeling personally threatened. They're feeling that they will get some benefits from affirmative action. So the composition of the electorate in 1996 and what it was like up until this year really made it very difficult to repeal Proposition 209 and even to have that conversation.
Yeah. Tom, is there anything you'd want to add to that in terms of what is it about 2020 that makes this a good year to finally make a run at overturning Prop 209?
Thank you, Michael. I think there's two factors at play. One that Eva described, which is how California has changed in 24 years. It's important to remember that Prop 209 came in the mid-90s, and it was a time when there were a handful of very divisive racial wedge issues that were put on the ballot in California and that exploited the fact that white voters had a disproportionate share of the vote at the time. Now, perhaps, at least for the Latino community, the most notorious of these divisive measures was actually enacted 2 years previously in 1994. It was Proposition 187. And that was an anti-immigrant measure used by Governor Pete Wilson to secure his own re-election by inspiring white voters to come out to the polls and not only support him, but support Proposition 187. But exit polling on Proposition 187 told us that it was, in fact, a divisive issue for voters, that majorities of Asian American and African American voters voted no on Prop 187. 78% of Latinos voted no on Prop 187. So despite having all those voters of color against it, it was enacted by 59% of the vote. 2 years later, Proposition 209, the anti-affirmative action measure, was also championed by Pete Wilson and his appointee to the UC Board of Regents, Ward Connerly. And they were clearly once more interested in pushing a racial wedge issue on the ballot. And again, the exit polling told us that's how it played out. In this case, 76% of Latinos voted no on 209. 74% of African American voters voted no. 61% of Asian American voters voted no. But despite all of those voters of color being against it, supermajorities in each case, it still passed by 55% of the vote. So certainly 24 years later, the electorate in California has changed. If you just look at the racial composition of our electorate today, 27% of registered voters in California are Latino, 10% are Asian American, and 5 to 6% are African American. So you've got a total of 42% of registered voters in California today are people of color. And that means that if we have had similar proportions of those groups as existed against Proposition 209 now in favor of Prop 16, then this is a measure that passes easily. So we've changed demographically, as Eva explained. We've changed politically, in part because of those Pete Wilson hate-motivated racial wedge issues from the 90s. California has pretty rapidly evolved into being one of the most progressive states in the nation. So we have a different electorate. But the other thing that's significant about 2020 is what we're all experiencing, which is the pandemic and the associated recession, and then the reinvigorated Black Lives Matter movement. All three of those have really placed a spotlight on the kind of racial disparities that we all knew existed, but didn't have in our headlines perhaps every day. Now they are in the headlines every day. The disproportionate impact of the disease itself and the consequences of it, the disproportionate impact of layoffs and income reduction on communities of color, and of course, finally, the ongoing disparities in police violence and experience of police bias. These all have really brought to the forefront the kind of disparities that Proposition 209 has really prevented California from aggressively addressing. And that heightened awareness of the disparities that as a society we need to root out in order to succeed and thrive in the future, coupled with the changes in California, is what makes 2020 the right time for Proposition 16 and why we're looking forward to a victory in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, Tom. And I want to bring in Michele and Vincent next. But first, just for everybody who's watching, I want you to know that we all want you to participate as well. You can place questions in the comments box. So please go ahead and insert your questions as those come up, and we'll be sure to get to those questions a little bit later. So, I mean, that sounds all very compelling, what Tom just laid out in terms of the changed demographics. But regardless, I mean, the opponents of Prop 16 aren't going quietly. I mean, I was reading through my voter guide, as I do every time, on all my propositions, and I mean, you know, the opponents to Prop 16 are saying that it's going to impose quotas, it's going to divide Californians, it's going to perpetuate this stereotype that minorities and women can't make it unless they get special preferences. Michele, can you, first of all, just tell us what's wrong with those arguments and what Prop 16 actually will do?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Raben, for hosting this conversation. First, the biggest problem with the argument that it would reinstate quotas is that argument is false. Quotas are already illegal. They will continue to be illegal even when we win and pass Prop 16 in California. So the second argument in terms of the stereotype that women or minorities can't make it without preferential treatment, I think just positions the wrong question. You know, the real threat in higher education today is that preferential treatment does exist. It exists for the wealthy, it exists for the well-connected, for the powerful, for students who are fortunate to go to high schools that have many more resources. I think the real question we should be ensuring that we ask is, how do we support all students? And in particular, underrepresented students, students of color in California, Latinx, African American, Native American, Asian American students who are the first in their families, who get good grades, even when they're working jobs in order to help support families, and in this pandemic, helping to tutor their younger siblings. I think those are the things we should be valuing. You know, I was the product of affirmative action, and I was at UCLA in 1996 when the voters passed the ban on affirmative action. And I was there to see the devastating impact that it had. As a first-generation student going to college, I would not have earned a master's degree had it been for the fact that affirmative action fellowship was available to me. And I think what is problematic is that we've shut the door. You know, we've lost a generation of professionals. What affirmative action would do is, yes, it would allow affirmative action in admissions, both undergraduate and graduate schools. We would have more Latinx doctors today to deal with a global health pandemic that is disproportionately affecting Latinos in California had it not been for the ban. We would have more African American lawyers today to deal with the racial pandemic that continues to afflict the African American community and communities of color had it not been for the ban. So affirmative action would allow us to target resources to ensure that everyone actually has an equal opportunity to go to college, to succeed, to get public contracts, and to be hired, and really level the playing field.
Thanks. You know, one of the things that seems different now from a quarter century ago is what we're hearing from some groups that oppose reinstating affirmative action. Some groups are making this argument that affirmative action actually hurts Asian Americans who are applying to get into the UC system, for example. I feel like that wasn't really an argument we were hearing back in the 90s. Vincent, obviously the name of your organization seems to run counter to that argument, Chinese for Affirmative Action. Can you maybe kind of lay out a bit how you would argue against those claims that affirmative action is somehow hurting Asian Americans?
I think part of the problem is that the dominant media likes to portray Asian Americans in a very flat way, in a very stereotypical way, is only concerned about college admissions. And you know, affirmative action is much broader. It also addresses public contracting and small businesses. It addresses public employment. And it also addresses other aspects of education, including support, retention, scholarships, and so on. And so, across the board in all these areas and over the span of many decades, Asian Americans have benefited from affirmative action. I think with Prop 16 specifically, and the way we talk about the University of California admissions, we know that prior to Proposition 209, Asian American enrollment at UC was in the 30% point range. And since 209, it's remained about that. But actually, the admission rates for Asian Americans went down at UC after Proposition 209. At other public colleges and universities, we see that enrollment for Asian Americans have gone up in places that have affirmative action. So it really has been a very unfortunate attempt by the opposition of affirmative action programs to try and exploit real concerns that Asian Americans and all communities of color have around higher education scarcity, and to try and pit these communities of color against one another. I think the only correct way to measure progress for Asian Americans in higher ed or in education in K12 or across these other sectors is against against the ability for us to dismantle the systems of white supremacy that have historically kept us oppressed. Which is another way of saying is that our path forward for Asian Americans has always been and must continue to be to link up with other groups that have been disadvantaged and to create opportunity for everyone.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to add something?
Thanks, Michael. I wanted to go back. Michelle had pointed out that quotas, which of course our opponents use as often as they can, including in the ballot pamphlet that you're reading, she pointed out that they've been unlawful since 1978 under a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that actually came out of Bakke versus University of California. So there's a long history at the University of California of dealing with affirmative action programs and tailoring them to fit the law. But when we haven't had them for the last 24 years, it's brought us to the point that I wanted to identify today, and that is the following. Today in California, 60% of 12th graders are Black or Latino. 60%, 6 out of 10, of high school seniors are on the cusp of going on to higher education or career. So 60%, and yet at the University of California system-wide, among all undergraduates, only 29% are Black or Latino. 60 versus 29, that's less than half. That's a 31 percentage point gap for Black and Latino students in California. If California doesn't fix that, that's a problem for the future of the state. And you've got 60% of your adults on the cusp of becoming adults, 17, 18-year-olds. And 60%, that 60% are only going on to the highest university system in the state at a rate that's half that or less. That's a real problem for the state of California to thrive in the future, which is why this initiative, this ballot measure, Proposition 16, is so important for the entire state.
Thank you. And that kind of, Tom, that may bring some explanation to what I was going to ask next for Michelle or whoever wants to answer. It was, there was that LA Times article not too long ago that said that Latinos are the largest group of Californians admitted to the UC system. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to unpack that with what the numbers say, right? I mean,
yeah, I think it's good news to celebrate. Obviously, we are excited that Latinos are finally the largest group of admitted students into the University of California. But as I have said many, many times, that should have happened 10 or 15 years ago, just because of the rise in the Latino population. To unpack, the numbers that Tom just shared, 54% of high school graduates in California are Latino, and yet only 25% of those enrolled in the University of California are Latino. That's a significant gap in opportunity, and that is what contributes to the continued wealth gap in our state under, education of Latinos, who are the biggest ethnic minority group in our state. And so we have to do better. I know Vin wanted to add something, so I'll stop.
Well, not too much more. I mean, I think that what I would give texture to it is that the admissions process is oftentimes misunderstood. And so one of the things we also have to communicate to people is that when we look at college admissions across the board, that we also have to be very targeted. And so what we're seeing is that once voters understand that race and gender, when considered as factors, can only be considered as one of many factors and not the predominant one, there's also a lot more comfort, because I don't think that Asian Americans either want to be understood as just test scores, right? And so there's also a whole number of things that need to be done in the realm of higher education right alongside with affirmative action that I think advances all of these goals. And so part of what we're communicating to folks is to not see this as zero sum.
And I would add, Vin, to that point is that oftentimes we just look, Michael, at the undergraduate numbers, but we released a report at the Campaign for College Opportunity 2 years ago called Left Out that analyzed the lack of diversity in faculty, academic senate bodies, and college leaderships at the UC, at the Cal State system, and at our community colleges. Affirmative action would allow all of our public colleges and universities to use affirmative action to address the real lack of representation that exists in our campuses. For example, on the University of California, 39% of undergraduate students are Asian American, and yet only 14% of tenured faculty are Asian American. That's a huge gap, and it's a problem. And so I think Vin really speaks holistically to the challenge that we are in this together, right? That all of us face some kind of glass ceiling, and in some places a concrete ceiling. We know that, women faculty members at the University of California are also underrepresented. Again, affirmative action would give us the tool to ensure that students have in front of us professors that look like the state of California, that are preparing us for the global enterprise that this economy requires, and the diversity that this, that we deserve to have.
Thank you, Michelle. And I see we've gotten a number of questions already in the comment section. I encourage you to send in some more. I have just one other kind of topic I want to cover here, and that is the national context, right? In many ways, people look to California, right, as sort of the laboratory for the nation, right? Like new ideas get started in California. California influences the national debate in many ways. So a couple questions on that, and first is just the national legal context. And so Tom, as someone who's an attorney, a litigator, civil rights attorney and leader, I'd like to ask you about this. The Department of Justice recently sued Yale University, accusing them of discriminating against Asian American and white students. And even though in the past the Supreme Court has upheld the practice of race-conscious admissions, next week the full Senate's very likely to vote on whether or not to confirm a new Supreme Court justice, which could significantly rebalance the court. So taking these dynamics into account, I mean, are you anticipating, should Prop 16 pass, are you anticipating any legal challenges to it? And if so, what do you think the prospects would be for Prop 16 to be able to survive those challenges?
Well, when Proposition 16 passes, I don't expect any challenge to the face of it, because all it does is permits the state of California and our policymakers to do what 41 other states have been doing for the entire period of time, including the last 24 years. And that is considering the possibility of using affirmative action as one means to address the kind of gaping racial disparities that we have been talking about. And there's certainly nothing unlawful about permitting the state of California to do what other states have been able to do going back our entire history since the civil rights movement opened up the prospect of realistically looking at and trying to address the kinds of discriminatory effects and kinds of implicit discrimination we continue to see. Longer term, you've raised an important question about where the Supreme Court will be. Of course, as you know, it's unclear after this second of what could certainly be characterized as power grabs by the Republican majority in the Senate, first of all, preventing Merrick Garland from being seated in 2016, and contradictorily now rushing through a nomination from Donald Trump of Amy Coney Barrett, it's not at all clear that that split in the court would remain, because it's not at all clear that the court will remain the same size that it is today. The Congress can change the size of the Supreme Court, and certainly if the Barrett nomination goes through, I expect there will be serious discussion about that. But certainly the Supreme Court is going to weigh in on affirmative action again. It has, in the 24 years since Prop 209 was enacted, it has weighed in 4 different times on affirmative action in higher education through the 2 cases, Gratz and Grutter out at the University of Michigan, and twice on the Fisher versus University of Texas case. And since Prop 209, it's also weighed in through the Ricci case on affirmative action in public employment. So we can expect the Supreme Court to weigh in again. But in the meantime, California, if Proposition 16 is enacted, can take a leadership role on aggressively addressing racial disparities. When you think about what California's profile is today, it is for many the progressive counterbalance to what's coming out of the Trump administration. We've seen it in many different respects, in environment and immigrant integration, in you name the issue. The state of California has sued the Trump administration and in turn been sued by the Trump administration. But strangely, the Trump administration has never sued anyone in the state of California about what it has done to address racial disparities. One would expect that from an administration so focused on issues of race, and it hasn't happened. And I believe the sole reason is because Proposition 209 has prevented California from being a progressive counterweight that it otherwise would be with respect to these issues. Because Proposition 209 has not only prevented use of affirmative action in public education, public employment, and public contracting, it has also really restricted and limited, stifled our policy discussion in this state about racial disparities. We don't go through any of the careful consideration mandated by the Supreme Court of racial disparities and what causes them and what are the potential solutions. All of that required in order to consider implementing affirmative action. We don't go through that policy debate in the state of California because no elected official wants to highlight an issue like racial disparities if they know at the end of the line they aren't going to have the tools to fix the issue or significantly address the issue. Why would you want to highlight what you can't or are powerless to address? So we haven't had those discussions, we haven't had that debate, and that's the first thing that Prop 16 would do. Next day after it's certified in December isn't going to result in somebody immediately implementing a race or gender conscious affirmative action program. But what will happen is that our policymakers will begin vigorous discussion of how we can be a leader on this set of issues by analyzing racial disparities in education, employment, and contracting, identifying the sources of those disparities, and taking aggressive action, whether that's race conscious or race neutral, gender conscious or gender neutral, but taking aggressive action to address those disparities. That's a discussion that has been stifled by 209, and Prop 16 will lift that barrier away and permit us to have those discussions.
So that's really encouraging. And beyond sort of the legal and policymaker space, and Eva, I would love to get your thoughts on this. You know, obviously the national dialogue on race and racism has really intensified this year, no doubt about that. And so kind of reflecting on what Tom has just shared, you know, when Prop 16 passes, how do you think it's going to help shape or contribute to that national dialogue around race and racism?
Well, I apologize to everybody for the crackling, and I hope you can hear us. But I'm an attorney as well, and so there'll be lots going on in the legal arena. But what we found very interesting in the whole journey from getting polling results in August of last year to having ACA 5 passed out of the legislature, which put Proposition 16 on the ballot, was this. We were very nervous about whether or not we could get the votes to get it out of the legislature. But 2 things happened which directly impact on the question you just asked. One, as Michele has pointed out, COVID-19, as some people are calling it, really showed that we do not have a race or colorblind society. You even have a virus that's racist in that it more adversely impacts Latinos, Asian Americans, because their businesses were boycotted when the president was calling it the China flu, but also African Americans and Native Americans. So you saw a glimmering in the legislature of people going, wow, racism is still alive and well. And then with the murder of Mr. George Floyd, America could no longer be in denial about the existence and power of racism. And so you saw lots of legislators who were kind of holding back coming forward to vote to put affirmative action on the ballot. The way I see it is as follows. One of the things that society is now grappling with is the existence of systemic racism. I'm a big NFL fan, and when I heard Roger Goodell talk about systemic racism, I almost fell off my couch. But that's what's happening in society. People are looking at systemic racism. To me, affirmative action chips away at systemic racism, and so therefore it's part of this national dialogue. Part of the reason that people of color have less power is we have less money, less influence. Look at how Congress operates. The people who give the most money to the various legislators, their rule, their point of view dominates. Now that we will have more people of color with more wealth, more educated, better jobs, promotions, I think that's an important part of this as well. There will be more political power in our hands, and we will be able to start chipping away at systemic racism. You have heard people talking in the presidential election, particularly Biden, about creating Black wealth. Well, getting $1 billion into the businesses owned by people of color and women helps create wealth. So we can talk abstractly about dismantling systemic racism, creating wealth in the Latino, African American, Native American, and Asian American communities and African American communities, but Proposition 16 makes that a reality. So to me, one of the reasons that we're going to win is that Californians are on the cutting edge of looking at race and society differently, and the whole country is looking at race differently. So this is a way to make manifest our desire to dismantle systemic racism. It's not going to eliminate systemic racism on December 17th when it's certified, but we feel if affirmative action is allowed to be in full flower in California, it will help chip away at systemic racism. So that's the way that California can be a concrete player in changing the racial dynamics in America.
Okay, thanks, Eva. So before we jump to, I want to take a question from the audience, but before that, I think one obvious question is just what people can do to support Prop 16. I assume that the Californians who are watching this are the folks who are really good about turning out to vote. So I assume the voter turnout of our audience is probably 100%. But Vincent, can I ask you, like, what would be some other ways, in addition to voting, which is of course the number one most important thing, what else can people do to help support passage of Prop 16?
Well, Prop 16 is really interesting in this sense that it's a topic that I think touches everyone, and that Americans of all backgrounds want to see more racial equality. They want to see more gender equality, and that's true if they live in California or not. And in this virtual world of Zoom meetings and Google meetings online, we all have this ability now to support one another. And so the Prop 16 campaign has a very robust organizing program where people anywhere can get involved to help get the word out through phone banks and text banks. Organizations that have membership in California, something very simple that you can do is send out to your list information about Proposition 16 and why it's so important. And then also the ability to financially contribute. California is a big state, so campaigns are expensive. And there's a need right now in these last 2 weeks to be able to deploy a combination of paid communications and other efforts that costs money. So people can support that. And I see it scrolling, at least on my screen, that visiting Vote Yes on prop16.org is the first step to be on our list and getting information, and very quickly we can get people mobilized.
Great. Does anybody else want to add anything to what Vincent shared? All right. Oh, Eva? Here, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
We find that once people find out what Proposition 16 does, they quickly come to the yes perspective. So those of you out there who are the validators in your community or your family, the people turn to for advice on elections, just let them know that it helps create equal opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Eva. Oh, good. You're back. So there's some disruptions on your line, but I'm glad you're back. All right. I promised we would go to public comments. So let's do that and get a question up on the screen. And folks, please continue to add your comments or your questions in the comment box so we can get to those as well. So first, from Gabriel Sandoval, how do issues of inequity at the K through 12 level inform discussions about access for persons of color at the post-secondary level and affirmative action programs? Michele, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, I'll jump in and then turn it over to Tom. Clearly, there's huge inequality in California, preparation in K-12, representation amongst our teacher force in K-12. So I'll say immediately, the ability to use affirmative action as a tool to address the very systemic racism that Eva eloquently talked about is it would allow us to hire teachers that look like our students. It would also allow us to target resources to schools that need support to prepare students for college, to give them access to AP courses. I always say, you know, if as a homeowner, if you had a leak in one corner of your house, you wouldn't tear down the entire roof and spread, you know, your resources to fix the entire roof. You would focus on where the leak is. And where the leak is underrepresented students, Latino students, African-American students, Asian-American students who don't have resources that wealthier, more privileged students in our society continue to have access to. And so with affirmative action, we can target outreach monies and resources to address inequality in K-12 and hire a teacher force that would look like the diverse student population we have.
So I think what we've learned, Michael, in this campaign is that our opponents like to set these issues up as though they're oppositional, that you either focus on higher education equal opportunity or you focus on K-12 equal opportunity. And they say focus on K-12, therefore you don't need to repeal Proposition 209. But it's a specific element of their misleading voters because they don't acknowledge what Michele just pointed out, which is Prop 209 didn't only apply to higher education, it applies to all public education. So that's K through 12 as well, which means the stifling of policy debate to prevent policymakers from looking at racial disparities very carefully and identifying causes and then implementing solution has also happened in the K-12 policymaking arena. And it has really prevented California from taking steps at all levels of education, from kindergarten through graduate education, to address these issues of racial disparities that I've described. I'll give you one example. California does now have a progressive funding formula that weights additional funding for foster youth, for low socioeconomic status youth, and for English learners. Now, those are all clearly race-neutral categories, but the legislature hesitated before implementing that weighted funding formula because of a concern that Prop 209 might be an impediment, because those race-neutral categories, foster youth, low socioeconomic status, English learners, also happen to coincide with being African-American, Latino, or Asian American. So they were concerned about that statistical overlap being a problem under Proposition 209. So they hesitated. Ultimately, it got through, but we still see that kind of policymaker hesitation, and that's entirely a product of Proposition 209. So the notion that somehow we can leave 209 in place and address educational disparities solely through the K-12 system is simply a falsehood.
Thanks. All right, let's see if we got another question here. So from Monica Lopez Romo, many large companies have diversity and inclusion strategies because they know having a diverse workforce makes them more competitive. So are there companies that have come out in support of Proposition 16?
I can take this, yes. In fact, all the largest chambers of commerce, all the largest business groups have come out in support. That includes also the chambers of commerce that represent the African-American community, the Latino community, the Asian community, and they've done that alongside organized labor. And so this isn't an issue that's either pro-business or pro-labor, it's actually pro-business and pro-labor. And within the business community, there's a recognition, as the question I think acknowledges, that it's not just about companies that are trying to do business with the state, but it's actually making sure that there's a diverse pipeline of workers so that all of our companies could not only be competitive, but actually just effective. So, you know, two of the largest businesses or companies that have supported are the health industry. So Kaiser Permanente, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Ultimate, because they're seeing right now in this pandemic that literally people of color are dying at disproportionate rates, or almost all of the children who have died of COVID are African American or Latino, and that in order to address that problem, we have to make sure that throughout their workforce, we have people who are culturally competent, that are from the communities that we need to reach, that are able to approach these long-term health issues in a more holistic way, that sees how addressing poverty would improve health outcomes, how addressing education would address health outcomes. And so this is really something that is for all of California, including big businesses.
Great. All right, let's go to the next question. We've got one ready. All right, from Laura Siniega. How will Prop 16 level the playing field for women in California with regards to education and employment? Who would like to take that one? Eva. Oh, I think you've gone on mute again. I don't know if that was you or... there we go.
There still is a lot of discrimination against women in the workplace. And so being able to take a look at that and make remedies for it and make sure that qualified women are employed makes a big difference. In the educational arena, and I think Michele talked about this, you see a lot of women professors, but you don't see a lot of women deans or a lot of women running educational departments. So that will help women as well. In the contracting arena, women-owned businesses, women entrepreneurs are growing at just enormous rates. And so the fact that the various contracting agencies in the country will have to look for qualified women businesses will also help us, because we'll make money as owners, we'll be able to hire women, hire people of color. So there are all kinds of ways that Proposition 16 helps us. And then in addition, just getting educated. The better educated you are, the better your prospects are in society for the things that I mentioned before. You make more money, your kids have better schools, you have better healthcare, your life expectancy extends. So there are all kinds of very concrete ways that women will be helped by affirmative action's return. So we hope all the women out there will vote yes, and we'll tell all your women friends to vote yes.
And I would just add to what Eva said is that it allows us to really target resources. So we can talk all day long about how women are underrepresented in sciences and engineering, but then do nothing about it because we don't have affirmative action as a tool to fix that.
Can I piggyback on that? Because Dr. Shirley Weber was the primary author of what has become Proposition 16. She tried to set up a STEM program, science, technology, engineering, and math for girls. It was totally wiped out because of Proposition 209. That's just insane. And so there are all kinds of big and little ways that women will be helped when we can take a look at the fact that women are often at a disadvantage in our society.
So, Michael, I just would like to extend off of that question. I love the answers from Michele and Eva, but I think we should point out that there are white men who will benefit from Proposition 16 because the kind of robust consideration of disparities and looking at all of the potential solutions.
Oh, it looks like Tom's line has frozen, but if he doesn't unfroze momentarily, we can come back to him in a moment.
Well, if I can just, I don't know what he was thinking, but here's what I can add to that. In the San Francisco Fire Department, they had height restrictions, and that kept out women, but it also kept out short men. So looking at requirements for jobs that are absurd and harm people, that's what affirmative action is about also. It's expanding the universe of qualified people. So that's one way that white men will get helped as well. Plus, many white men know women and people of color. And if we're all in this together and want the whole society to prosper together, we hope white men will be with us as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one sort of blunt way to put it, if a white man is married to a white woman or any woman who benefits from affirmative action, that's, the household as a whole is better off, so everybody wins.
Just saying.
Yeah. All right. Let's see, if Tom's link is back, he can continue his thought. Otherwise, let's go to the next question. All right. So for viewers who are outside of California, how can those of us who aren't voters in California support Proposition 16? Who would like to take that?
I could just quickly add, because Vin did a good job earlier, but I would say you can volunteer, you can text bank, you can phone bank California voters, you can donate if you go on Yes on Prop 16 so that we have the resources to connect with more voters. And you can tell your Californian friends why passing affirmative action is important, why you support it, and send out, an email blast to your own personal list. We know, as Eva said earlier, that when people understand what affirmative action would do and who endorses it, when they learn that Senator Kamala Harris, Governor Gavin Newsom, Dolores Huerta, Black Lives Matters co-founders, the ACLU, League of Women Voters all support Prop 16, they overwhelmingly join our side. So tell your friends.
Great, thank you. All right, well, I think let's do one more question, and then I want to kind of do a round robin closing question after that. So let's take this. Okay, here we go. When Massachusetts adopted marriage equality in 2004, it led to a backlash across the country that resulted in state laws and constitutional amendments banning same-sex marriage. So do you think we'll see a similar backlash to affirmative action if Prop 16 passes?
Well, I'd like to speak to this.
Yeah.
I think it's actually the opposite. I think what we know about Proposition 209 when it passed was that it was one of the first bans on affirmative action that was then cloned to 7 or 8 other states in the country. And again, we spoke about it at the beginning, but it was part of this effort to divide Americans and to pit, in particular, white Americans against communities of color in a way that was very unfortunate. So I think by passing Prop 16, we can hopefully start to turn things back the other way in a moment when our entire country is having a racial reckoning and searching for ways to be more proactive about addressing the structural racism that I don't think benefits anyone. So I think when we pass Prop 16, there'll be a possibility to be able to start looking at these other states that also have bans on affirmative action. And I should also note that affirmative action is legal in the private sector. And so even here in California, on the private side, companies practice affirmative action and actually herald it as one of the most important ways that they can increase diversity and inclusion. So in many respects, Proposition 16 corrects an outlier. It corrects an outlier where California should not be on this list of places that literally places blindfolds on ourselves and ties our hands to taking on the problems of structural racism and discrimination against women.
Yeah, Eva.
I would also say that look at really what happened after marriage equality was started in Massachusetts. Yes, there was backlash, but then Gavin Newsom, when he was the mayor, started the whole ball rolling. There was a whole national strategy, and now marriage equality is the law of the land. So you want to be on the right side of history. There's always back and forth. The oppressors don't want things to change, but you need to be on the right side of history and make things happen. I'm very nervous about this new Supreme Court justice because Alito and Thomas are making noises about undermining marriage equality. But I think you always want to be on the right side of history, and Proposition 16 absolutely is.
Great, thank you. All right, so I know we're working on getting Tom Saenz back, but in the meantime, I have a closing question that I would like for everyone to be able to answer. We started today's conversation talking about what happened a quarter century ago, right? And what the legacy of that has been. Now what I want you all to do is just let your imaginations run free and think about 25 years into the future. And when Prop 16 passes, after that happens, what are your dreams for how California will look 25 years from now with Prop 16 having passed? And I'll start with whomever wants to go first.
I'll start because I'm going to be really, really old in 25 years. And so I hope sitting from my porch, retired, I go, oh, there are no more fires. We figured everything out. Oh, people of color we have our fair share of the tax dollars that we pay. Oh, children of color are getting into the UC systems. There's no fighting between different groups. And here's the other thing I hope happens. And this isn't directly on Proposition 16, but as I look at the political landscape, I hope that California leads an effort for campaign finance reform, for full public financing of elections. Because if you think of all the bad things that happen because money rules, if there can be a level playing field money-wise, that will help as well. And that's not directly on Proposition 16, but we are people who have a broad vision of how to make things better. So I hope that there'll be this conversation when I'm, 25 years down the road. Remember that horrible couple of years with COVID and before Proposition 16 went into place, and who was that president we had then? I just can't remember. So I'm just hoping things will be fabulous in 25 years, and I'm alive to see it.
That's fabulous. Who is next? Who wants to go next?
I can go. I mean, I think everything that Eva said and plus. And so for me, the plus would be an acknowledgement that we can always do better and to look back at this time as really a choice between the status quo or affirmative action in the broadest sense, which is that we always have to do more to see who we're not seeing, to listen, to see, to hear who we're not hearing, and to acknowledge history. And I think that this, fundamentally to me, affirmative action is about that choice. To sort of reckon with our history, to reckon with inequities in a way that's smart, that is practical, that is mature. And so I think affirmative action on the ballot is a chance to start to do that, not just here in California, but hopefully leading the way across the country.
Yeah, and for me, I think we all hope to be retired and on the porch, rocking chair with that vision, Eva, as well. But, you know, for the last 16 years, I've dedicated my entire professional career to fighting for educational opportunity and higher education in California. So it's interesting coincidence that now I get to fight for Prop 16 and for affirmative action when the door was shut after I walked through it at UCLA. So, you know, my dream, my vision, my hope for California, and I'll do anything I can to fight for it, is that it will not matter what the color of your skin is, what race or ethnicity you are, where you live, how much money is in your bank account, that if you are talented and want to go get a higher education, that you will be able to graduate from college and have access to every single opportunity that exists in our great state. And in the short term, my dream and hope is for the Dodgers to win the World Series and for Prop 16 to pass on November 3rd.
Okay, that's right. Go Dodgers. Tom, you've been able to join us back, thankfully, and right on time. So this is the question: 25 years from now, with Prop 16 having passed, what's your dream for what California looks like?
Well, with Prop 16, it's not a dream, it's a reality, which is we will have better and more effective and efficient selection mechanisms and criteria for education, employment, and contracting. And that's the point I was making before my computer crash, which is we all benefit from that. When you have a vigorous analysis that tells you, for example, that using standardized tests is actually not an effective and efficient way of deciding who gets into college, and you're able then to identify the problem and solve it by eliminating the use of standardized tests, then that's progress for everybody, including, as I said before my computer crashed, white men will benefit from that, because there are currently white men who are being kept out of college because of standardized tests and because they're just not good at standardized tests. But when you engage in a rigorous analysis of what's causing racial disparities, you identify flaws in the system that affect everyone. And you then are able to put in place better systems, better criteria to make selections. And that's where California will be with Prop 16 in 25 years. And that will make all the difference for our state continuing to thrive.
All right, well, these are fantastic notes to end on. So thank you, Tom. Thank you, Michele. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Eva, for joining us today, sharing your insights, your wisdom. And I just wish you all luck in the days ahead for the Dodgers, yes, but especially for Prop 16. And thank you also to our audience and everyone who watched today and everyone who shared their questions and thoughts. We really appreciate it. So thank you to everyone. Be well, stay healthy, and wishing you all success.